Good morning, good afternoon, depends on in which time zone you are currently in. I would like to welcome you all to our seminar, The Politics of Academic Text Production in a Global Context, Language, Locality, Knowledge. This is our seventh seminar in our series of seminars on science and semi-peripheries that we are here organizing at our research group. Today we will proceed in the following manner, and before I will introduce our guest, I would like to just give you a brief outline of how we will proceed. So first of all, I will invite our guest speaker to introduce us to the main topic of today's seminar. She will talk for around 40-45 minutes. And at this point, I will ask Ola Svatek, our colleague, also a member of our research group, to give a short co-presentation, maybe posing some questions to our guest. And then our guest will have a short time to reply to some of the Ola's questions and comments. And finally, we will move to the second part of our meeting, in which I would like to invite all the participants to join in and pose questions, add comments, and we will move to more free discussion. Of course, I will be moderating it. So at the end, if you have any questions that you would like to pose, just please use the hand inbuilt button in the application, and I will ask you. Okay. Finally, I would like to welcome our guest, that is Professor Mary Jane Curry. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation and joining us. I think that we are starting this year, as this is the first seminar, our seminar in 2022, with a very strong topic and very strong guest. So thank you very much for accepting our invitation. Professor Curry is an associate professor in the Warner Graduate School of Education and Human Development, University of Rochester. Curry's research explores various facets of academic discourse as a barrier or form of cultural capital for users of English as an additional language and other types of non-traditional learners. Since 2001, she has conducted funded research on the experiences of scholars and graduate students writing for journal publication. First, she examined the English academic writing and publishing of Southern and Central European scholars. And more recently, she has been studying the experiences of engineers, particularly women, in publishing research. In a second strand of research undertaken while a research fellow at the Open University Center for Language and Communications, Curry explored the academic literacy experiences of non-traditional UK students taking distance access courses taught over the telephone, work that connected to her dissertation research on immigrant community college students in an academic writing course. So, Professor Curry, once again, this is a great pleasure to having you here, and I would like to initiate our meeting by asking you to join us and to give us your talk.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here. Obviously, there's benefits and drawbacks to Zoom, but I think one of the great things is just to be able to interact with colleagues in this kind of a manner without all of the bother and expense of traveling, although I love to travel. So let me just give you a little bit of an overview of what I'm going to talk about today. So this is a talk on the politics of academic text production. And this has been the focus of research that I've been doing with Dr. Teresa Lillis, who's retired from the Open University in the UK. First, I'm just going to give a broad summary of our interests in our in the research that we've been conducting, both together and we also each have our own separate research studies. I'm going to give a brief overview of the study that we began 20 years ago, and Then I'm going to just narrow the focus to one of the analyses that we did for a paper that appeared in the ILA Review in 2015 that focuses on how journal reviewers and editors orient to English and to language and to the work of preparing language and making language acceptable for publication, specifically as they respond to papers that are submitted by the multilingual scholars in our study. So this one is really focusing on language. I was saying a little bit before we got started with the talk that one of our aims in broader scope has been to widen the lens to look beyond language. But in this particular analysis, we're looking very closely at language. And then we'll have time for discussion. So our project, Professional Academic Writing in a Global Context, which we call PAW, we launched it with this broad overarching research question: in what ways is the global status of English influencing academic knowledge production and exchange in the 21st century? So this was in 2001 that we first got an internal grant from the Open University to start this work. And as we were also talking about before we got started, the disciplinary communities that we affiliate with and that we see ourselves as being part of include applied linguistics, writing studies, sociolinguistics of knowledge, TEFL, TESOL, EAP. These are all different iterations of teaching English or learning English, and also education. So we have a kind of constellation of interests in writing for publication for academic purposes. First and foremost, as ethnographically oriented researchers, we're very interested in the empirical aspects of what is actually happening. And in writing studies, particularly over the past few decades, there's been a small shift in this direction, but a lot of writing work and a lot of teaching work really takes a kind of decontextualized approach and really looks more at text and trying to get students to learn how to imitate text in the process of internalizing them. What we wanted to do was really see what are scholars doing, not what somebody thinks they should be doing. We're also very interested in research methodology, and we've developed a lot of methodological tools to help us understand the production of academic texts for publication as situated within their specific context of production. So this touches again on the question of resources, institutional context, language policy, a lot of different dimensions to what's happening. We're also highly interested in how we can make sense of what's going on and bringing different theoretical lenses to bear. And I'll talk about that a little bit later in terms of this presentation. And the ideological dimensions: what are the consequences of what's going on? What are some of the driving forces in terms of how people think about academic writing for publication, how people think about publishing in a competitive global neoliberal context, and how people think about language and writing. And then we also are interested, as people who work in sort of applied fields, in what are the practical implications of our work. And some of our publications have focused on how to take some of our research findings and make them available to scholars and instructors and policymakers in terms of how might things change as a result of what we've learned. So this study involves, and I'm using the present tense because we're still in touch with a lot of our participants and we still reach out to them periodically for updated information. 50 scholars working in fields of psychology and education in 4 national sites: Hungary, Slovakia, Spain, and Portugal. And I think we have about 13 institutions represented across those 4 sites. And as I said, we began this study in 2001, and we weren't planning a 20-year study. I'm not sure anybody plans a 20-year study unless they have mega funding. This was really a shoestring funding kind of project, but we began with a small grant in 2001 and had a slightly larger grant after that. And really, we've just kind of kept it going through pure determination. But we developed a methodology we call text-oriented ethnography. So that's in short, it's studying the production of academic texts within their context of production. So it's bringing together a focus on text, a focus on language, and really trying to understand it as situated in each scholar's experiences, perspectives, institutional, local, national, and global scales of context. So that's our main study, and then we've done some kind of offshoot studies. Teresa has had another small grant looking at corpora of published articles in psychology to understand citation practices. She's also done a little bit of additional work interviewing journal editors in the foresights who are editing journals that use English as a medium of communication. I had a Fulbright fellowship in Chile a while ago, and I was studying Chilean scholars and their attitudes and experiences, and also the relationship between their English and Spanish publications. I also had a separate study on engineers writing for publication. And then we did a more recent kind of phase of our study where we were looking at the experiences of the female scholars among our 50 participants to understand their experiences. And in 2021, we've just written a series of papers widening the lens from just looking at English to also looking at how our language is used by scholars throughout their professional lives, in their research practices, and in their publications. And we've always documented scholars' uses of other languages in our publications, but these papers really take a kind of specific look at the role of multilingualism. So the methodology that we developed, which we call text-oriented methodology, has two types of core data. It has ethnographic data, which sort of following traditional ethnographic approaches, we weren't able to live for long periods of time in our foresights, but we made at least about 70 visits between the two of us over a long period of time. So when we had funding, we were able to go frequently. We were often hosted for a couple of weeks by the institutions that we had connections with in the sites. We made observations, we took field notes, we kept researchers' journals. We did some group discussions, interviews with librarians. We looked at policy data and took lots of photographs. And then the second set of data is text and text-oriented data. And this is a huge database that we collect piece by piece. Scholars were extremely generous in saving their work for us, in saving different versions of their manuscripts for us as they were working on them. So this 3,000 texts by scholars, that will involve, in some cases, 15 drafts of a particular paper. Also correspondence that they had about their manuscripts with gatekeepers. Those could be journal editors, reviewers. It could also be people that and I'll get to this in a minute, people we call literacy brokers, so people who might have helped them with the manuscript. Correspondence with co-authors, for example. And then we had probably close to 300 discussions about these texts with scholars in their text-focused interviews. So over time, we have with some scholars 12, 15 interviews about sometimes a whole discussion of just how one text evolved. Ongoing email with participants. Now we have access to following participants on websites like researchgate.net. One of our papers this past year, we used analysis of their CVs over the past 20 or so years, or over their careers, to see what languages they were using. In order to organize this data and to analyze it, we've created a methodology we call text histories. And so for each particular text on its journey toward publication or toward not getting published, we've been looking very closely at how the drafts change over time, who's involved in these different drafts, these people that we call literacy brokers, co-authors, other people. What are people's investments in these different moments and drafts of an ultimate publication? And so we've used this as a much more micro level way of looking at what's going on. And then from those text histories, and I'll be getting into that with this particular paper today, what do they tell us about English medium knowledge production? So it's a kind of a methodology that allows us to go in and out, changing the focus at different moments. The text history allows us to interweave the contextual ethnographic understandings of the larger context with the textual analysis of particular papers that are being written by scholars. And we've mainly focused on journal article production because, as I'm sure people here know, that's generally, particularly in fields outside of the humanities, considered the kind of gold standard in terms of academic production that most institutions are valuing. Let's see. Okay, I'm not sure if this is showing up. Okay, this is a quotation from Jan Blammert, who was a Belgian sociolinguist that really influenced our work very heavily. Unfortunately, died very prematurely. But he really gets at the heart of how language is always contextualized. And so understanding that language, he says here, is no way in which language can be contextless when you're adopting this ethnographic anthropological tradition. To language, there's always a function, a shape, a specific mode of operation, and a set of relations between the active language and the wider patterns of resources and their functions. And that really captures the drive that we've had to understand what's going on, not just with a particular text or a particular person, but within the context. This next set of slides shows some of the, here's the small map there, which will be familiar to many people in Poland, of Central and Southern Europe where we were, and some of our ethnographic data. So a scholar's office, a hallway in a particular institution, a bulletin board with, common kinds of things that are familiar to everyone in academia, policy documents, which I find particularly interesting because in the US, this isn't something that we would typically have posted on a bulletin board. It's usually hidden away somewhere in a binder or in on a website these days. So these are, let me see, is this coming up? Seems to be stuck. This is a small text extract, which we have in this case with track changes made by a person we would call a literacy broker. A very small extract from a field note taken by one of us. Okay, so this kind of data, it raises interesting questions for researchers when you're researching contexts that you could feel are very familiar. So I noted that there's some things here that are not exactly familiar to me as an American researcher. Just institutionally, we don't tend to have policies. We do have some, and if you've been in institutional spaces in the US, you'll see there are more legal policies like American with Disabilities Act, et cetera, but we don't have our internal university policies listed and made visible on a bulletin board. So that was quite interesting. But looking at, for example, the hallway or the scholar's office, these feel very familiar. And when you're an ethnographer, you need to be really careful of not taking for granted what you think is happening in a context that's very familiar. You have to really insert some distance to really make sure that you're not just jumping to conclusions about what's going on. So we've published a lot of papers and books, and so I'm not going to go over everything we've done, but just to give some of our core key findings from the past 20 years. And an important thing to remember here is, again, for other scholars who aren't doing this kind of work, some of these findings may seem very obvious because you're living these experiences. So first of all is documenting pressures on multilingual scholars to publish in English. When we began this research 20 years ago, we were about at the maybe going up on the wave of the global push for English, but it wasn't as commonly discussed as it is now. And so we just kind of looked into this topic in terms of how popular it became as a global discussion. There was research starting in about the mid-'80s, particularly by John Swales and other people that were starting to note this emerging phenomenon. but it really took off. It has really taken off in the past 20 to 25 years. One thing that we documented through our ethnographic work was the role of the what we call evaluation regimes, the institutional and national and sometimes departmental policies telling scholars what counts, how work is evaluated, what is rewarded. And we know that these practices are extremely variable. They're even variable within institutions across departments. In some cases, they're variable across individuals. And we're particularly interested in how those policies, whether they were implicit or explicit, influence scholars to write in different languages, what kinds of communities to contribute to, and how they respond. So one thing we've documented in one of our papers, 2014 paper, is that many scholars are very savvy about understanding, I need to do this in order to meet these requirements, but I'm also going to do this because I care about doing this. I'm committed to it. And we and other people have documented the double burden that this can often place on scholars to do a lot more work than those of us who live in an environment where we only have to work in one language. These evaluation regimes contribute to creating these tensions or dilemmas about what to publish and when, whether to work to publish in English with the idea of reaching a broader audience, whether to work in a local language with the idea of contributing knowledge in a local community and building up a local community's social and research infrastructures. And along those lines, we have noted of our 50 scholars, only 2 of them stopped publishing in their local language. And both of those scholars are now working in Anglophone contexts. So there's a lot of discussion in the field about, is this a generational thing where the older generation will continue to publish in local language and young scholars will be completely adept at English and everything will happen in English? Or are there moments when scholars go back and forth? And what we've seen is that scholars are not abandoning their local languages. And in many cases, they're publishing in 2 or 3 or 4 languages. As I mentioned before, one of our findings related to people that we call literacy brokers. These are people who may or may not be acknowledged. So sometimes these are co-authors, colleagues, translators in a department, or translators that scholars will pay. Also people that are called authors editors. Sometimes they're friends. We have examples of people paying their kids' English teacher to work on something. We have a nice example of a participant giving a bottle of whiskey to a friend who edited a paper for him. So again, these are situations that are probably very familiar to many people here. But the language brokers also include what we call institutional brokers, reviewers and editors who are gatekeepers of journal publication. And that will be what I'm focusing on a bit later here. Literacy brokers are often part of scholars' academic research networks. And in some of our analysis, we've looked at the networks that scholars have or built or became part of, and looked at the way that resources were made available through their networks and how they developed their access to the kind of publishing that they wanted to do. We've also done an analysis of the women in our study, and as I mentioned before, that gender is an important but often unacknowledged dimension to academic writing, not specifically to use of language and production of text itself, but access to resources, time being a major resource that we all have a limited supply of, but in many cases, women have less time, both institutionally and personally. And as I was just saying, there is some evidence that scholars' practices change over time. Interestingly, there are some scholars who will publish in English more earlier in their career, and then as they feel more established, they feel they have more freedom to go back to publishing in the local language for their own interest, purposes, and pleasure. And multilingualism is woven not only throughout scholars' text production practices, but also throughout research production practices. And there's been plenty of research done in the science, sociology of science, that shows the role of language in research. And there's been a little bit of burst of research in the past couple of years looking at multilingual research practices. So that exactly feeds into what we're talking about here. And then finally, some of our work we've been able to use in giving workshops to scholars and students. We've written one book that's aimed at practitioners, and we've done some work with some initiatives to support scholars. There's one in particular called Author Aid, and there's a new one that's just been launched by a colleague in the US. So maybe I should just take a breather here and just see if there are any quick questions about any of that overview that I've given. Okay. Oh, should I just keep going then?
I don't see any questions.
Okay.
Hands raised, so I think we're good to proceed.
Okay, thanks. So in the analysis that I'm going to present next, this paper, we're specifically focusing on how reviewers orient to language. And by reviewers here, we mean reviewers and editors orient to English and language when reviewing papers submitted for publication. And how do orientations matter in their overall evaluation of papers? So we know that peer review is a hot topic. This set of reviews that we analyzed doesn't really, it predates a lot of interest in. There's not open peer review here. So this is all traditional, generally double-blind peer review. Before we did this paper, we took a look at the literature on peer review, and we analyzed it as basically doing three things. First of all is characterizing the stances that evaluators or peer reviewers take in research, in reviewing research papers. So people have looked at the patterns of in terms of content. What are they, what types of comments are people making? Compliments, criticisms, looking at, I mean, some people have done here, Fortanet Gomez has done, created taxonomy of formal and functional features. Paltridge used Speech Act analysis, and different frames or models have been used to analyze how people are using language, what kinds of language they're using in their reviews. So he talks about directions, suggestions, clarifications, recommendations. So if to anyone who's ever had a paper reviewed, you could probably go through and see many of these represented in the reviews that you've received. The second broad tranche of research looked at how reviewers are characterized, how reviewers are commenting on the content of the paper they've reviewed. So this has much more to do with reviewers in a particular discipline, not so much focused on language or not focused on the Speech Act kind of analysis, but just looking at what are they talking about. Technical detail, claims, discussions, references and format, content. What is interesting here is how language already starts to show up as a kind of content. And of course, we would certainly argue that you can't separate language from content. Language is how content is conveyed. Some studies here have broken down the reviews into different, how much they're focusing on content versus language. So they've all taken slightly different approaches. And then the third broad area of research on reviews has looked at what scholars think about it. A couple studies have found differences in experiences between novice and senior scholars, basically looking at scholars' perspectives. And as you might expect, scholars have often felt like the reviewers, particularly when they're commenting on language, are really being unfair in terms of using that as a screen through which they're evaluating the content. So methodologically, the main focus of the research that existed is about individual reviews. Very few people have access to sets of reviews or clusters of reviews. And ideologically, they are mainly looking at English as one standard fixed resource. And this is one of the common ideologies of language that people in the world use, but even people in our field of applied linguistics have tended, particularly in teaching English for academic purposes, tended to view English as being fairly monolithic, not accepting them. Of course, people know the difference between American English and British English, but not looking at the many, many more varieties of English than that. Another thing we noticed in the literature is, and we've noticed this before, is that there's often a slippage or an overlap between a category of writers as being non-native users of English and novice scholars. And we know in our research, where we had very esteemed scholars who had been publishing for decades in their local context, in their regional context, they were not novice scholars. Many of them were also not novice non-native users of English or low proficiency level of English, but some of them were. But it was very clear that you can't look at a person's academic profile and say just because someone is a non-native speaker of a language that automatically makes them a novice scholar. So often in the literature, multilingual scholars have been positioned as apprentices or more junior. So that's something we've really tried to push back against. Many of the conclusions from the research are looking at pedagogical implications or how to teach people how to be successful in academic practices rather than kind of just as a basic level of exploration, understanding what is going on here, which is our ethnographic lens. So in this particular analysis, we created 95 text histories. So if you remember, I talked about we've collected something like 3,000 data pieces of textual data and about 700 pieces of correspondence. So when those all relate to one particular paper, we put them all together. And we also, so to create a text history, which is a kind of summary and history of what's happened with this particular paper from its inception through to as far as it goes in terms of publication or abandonment or rejection, we were able to construct 95 text histories. So a text history has copies of drafts of the text, including the submitted articles, copies of reviewers and editors' comments, and also interviews with the authors. Now, obviously, we don't know who the reviewers are, so we were not able to interview the reviewers, but we have it all from the paper author's perspective. To analyze for this particular paper, we really focused on the reviewers' comments and looking at what is theoretically called uptake, which basically means how are they reading the text, how are they responding to it. So we're looking for specific comments on English and language. So we looked at all of these, and this is just pure manual analysis. We don't use any fancy kinds of programs for this. For every set of reviews and letters from an editor, we were looking at every time English was mentioned, every time language was mentioned, which often refers to style and writing clusters of categories like grammar, organization, all of these kinds of constellation of features that we would expect to see when people are talking about writing. But rather than looking at these corpora of which some journal editors have had access to and done some studies of, we're looking at how these are all related to the paper as it evolved over time. And as you can imagine, for those of you who've been in this game for quite a while, sometimes a paper goes through a few rounds of revision for a particular journal, and then it doesn't get accepted, and then it goes to another journal. And so in some of our cases, and some of what we're going to talk about here, these are actually papers that had that same trajectory, where they went through a round or two of revision, got rejected, and then went to a new journal. In terms of analysis, looking at the ideologies of language, we take this term from sociolinguistics and cultural geography called indexicality, which is how to look at data with both the referential or denotational notion of meaning what is it pointing, what is it saying, what is it representing, as well as the indexical, what is it pointing to. So when we look at, for example, the term English, it's not a neutral term. It's not just a descriptor of one of many languages in the world. It means it has a lot more meanings than that. And so English points to a lot of other things, including, in many cases, quality, including the identity of being somebody who knows how to write for research publication. So the first finding from this analysis is that English and language matter. They come up in many of the reviews. And in fact, I'm not sure if the handout, I did send the handout, I think. Sorry, it doesn't have it on there, but these are some telling examples of the kinds of comments that really just signal that English is a very vivid concern for many of the reviewers. Manuscripts needs a bit of work, quite a bit of work on its English grammar and spelling, revised and worded in a more idiomatic and simple way, which is an interesting, in my view, kind of contradiction. Then we have some really powerfully negative comments. The writing style is quite deficient. It is clear that these problems are not just due to the fact that English is not the first languages of the author. By the way, I respect them for their effort, although I've just called them deficient. Paper needs to be corrected for English, and native speakers should correct the manuscripts. There's been a lot of discussion in our field about this notion, this phantom native English speaker, because as we know, just being a native speaker does not make you an academic writer, and it does not give you disciplinary knowledge to be able to support somebody writing a manuscript. So in 61% of these 95 text histories, reviewers foregrounded significant problems with the language or the English, or at least one of them within the set of reviewers and editors. And when they do talk about English as being a problem, they mark it particularly as being non-native or foreign language or second language. Our second finding from this analysis is that English is construed as a stable monolithic semiotic resource, meaning that there is one English, that it's a standard English, everybody agrees on it, and it's something that many of these authors are perceived to not have fully achieved. Needs quite a bit, has to be revised, etc. So we've seen these comments, and they really point to this kind of mythological level of English, which we know is not something that's easily attained by English native speakers either, but the reviewers seem to be construing it as a second language writing problem. And that's our third finding here. The problem is construed with writing in a second or foreign language. Extract 7, I think, is quite interesting. There are quite a number of instances in the text where it's clear that English is not the author's first language. They cannot be blamed for that, of course. And I can say, and we've just been writing about this a bit, my colleague Teresa actually does publish in Spanish academically, but I speak a number of languages, but I have never published academically in them because I have the linguistic privilege of not having to do that. I would really be curious to know how many of these reviewers have ever written for publication in another language. And as I was just saying, the solution is presented in the form of a native speaker. And this is an interesting kind of, I think, shunting off to another side. I don't have to deal with this, get somebody else to help you with it. And I'm going to come back to that point. This term native English speaker really comes through very strongly, not only in this study, but many other people have talked about this. Extract 11, you may want to give your paper to a native English speaker to edit so that you'll be sure that the meaning of what you want to say passes. Again, I would really question to what extent that's feasible. Okay, so I don't think we really have time to go through the handout, but the handout kind of extracts the first text history from the article and shows in the narrative sort of how these comments from the editors and the reviewers landed with the authors, how they responded to it, and what the next stages were as they revised their paper and sent them off. So the key question here about how do these orientations affect the uptake of the papers? First of all, we would say there were clearly some differences to reviewers, they weren't all having the same response, but and then the editors, of course, are acting as mediators to the responses. And so one thing that we saw is that sometimes what we saw in the reviews, and again, anyone who's had reviews back from a paper will have understood this or experienced it, the reviews don't always match up with what the editor's decision is. But so in this case, there's some gaps there, which if you have a look at the paper, you can see. The different evaluations of language play an important role in terms of what the reviewers are encouraging the authors to do in order to get their paper published. So I'm going to skip through this to go to the orientations that we identified. First of all is this idea that there's a problem here. I'm identifying a problem, but it's your problem to solve. It's not my, and we call this concerned deficit. It's not my problem. I'm just a content reviewer. The second orientation is basically saying, I see there's a problem. I'm really sorry you have to do this. I respect you highly for being a user of English as an additional language, but it's still your problem. And the third orientation we call concerned interventionist, which is saying it's a problem we're going to work on together. So again, the extracts from the reviews support this. The fact this is the deficit, it doesn't absolve authors from having their work copy edited by a native speaker. The second one, absolute necessity, the papers are presented with an acceptable standard of English. And the third one, this is from an editor who was actually doing some language work on the paper and saying, I've worked on it directly. Please do not take offense. I'm doing this in the spirit of making this manuscript as sharp and influential as it can be. So these three orientations are supported by the 95 text history analyses that we've done here. And they really index a wide range of ways that people are interacting with scholars who are writing in English as an additional language. And I think what we can take away from this is that, sorry, let me go back, that, you know, there's some serious implications here for how particularly journal editors can mediate the kinds of negative comments that come through and understand that in this global world, it's imperative for this not just to be seen as a deficit and as a problem. Okay, I think I'm gonna skip through this. This is basically just summarizing what we're doing. And thank you, comments. And this is a slide of some of the books we've produced here from our work. So I hope I haven't gone on too long, but I'm really curious to hear what people are thinking.
Great, thank you very much. So without further ado, I would like to invite Ola to join us and give her reaction paper.
Yeah, so I don't have a full paper, but I would just want to say thank you so much, Dr. Curry, for your presentation and summarizing so much of your work that you have done. And I have prepared a couple of questions, so maybe for the sake of time, I'll just use a few because I wanted to take this opportunity to kind of have a little bit of a discussion. So my question for you is related to the role of editors in disciplines other than language and writing, because in your data set, the writers were engaging in post-submission brokering in disciplines of education and psychology. So this research shows that there is a lot of room for growth in terms of critically approaching English as a language used for writing. And as the editors and reviewers maintain the notion that English is a stable semiotic resource, and they kind of believe that there is such a thing as standard English in which all the academic papers should be submitted. So in other words, there's this prescriptivist approach to English and English in academic publishing specifically, and it seems to be very much alive and well. And this notion of English as not being a stable semiotic resource and being like a complex construct has been discussed and complicated in applied linguistics, and this kind of linguistics, and this notion of like native speaker has also been kind of disproved. And so that's just like common knowledge in field of applied linguistics. But when we think about education and psychology, it seems that and some just like general broad academic other academic fields, it just seems that this idea that there's no such thing as standard English, it just seems that it's not breaking through, and like it's not becoming popular and common knowledge really. And I wonder if like maybe one reason for it is that there is no systematic approach to educating peer reviewers and editors. And it's really not surprising because there is this sort of work is unpaid service to the field, and we can really cannot really ask more of editors and peer reviewers, even though there's clearly a need for this type of work. So maybe from your observation, from this like 20 years research, do you think that there is any progress made in just broader academic publishing in terms of dismantling the notion of English as a stable semiotic resource, or just like dismantling this English as having a standard version? And what do you think would it take to make a change or a dent in these other disciplines, so like we all get on the same page?
Yeah, I mean, you're going right to the heart of, how can we use this research and research in this field, looking at English for research publishing? How can we use this to improve the conditions for thousands of scholars around the world? I mean, I'm sure Ola, there has been some recent research that shows that in reality, there isn't a standard. Even there's one article looking at engineering manuscripts where it's documented that in this data set that was looked at, there's not one standard English, that there's a lot of individual variation of course, there's always individual variation even within so-called standards, but that there was enough data there to show that enough non-standard English is being used, that it's sort of like again, our interest empirically is what is really going on. And other people are working in this same vein to say, well, actually, there's a discourse of standard English. There's this ideology of standard English, but what's really going on in journal publications? So I think that's one interesting point, is that this ideology and discourse of standard English, when we look at what actually gets published, is not always carrying through 100%. But I think that's a kind of one approach to reality, but it doesn't really address what you're asking. I mean, the book that we wrote for scholars about, let me just get to that one, A Scholar's Guide to Getting Published in English, it doesn't really focus so much on language. It doesn't really focus so much on English. And I think one of the things that we want people to take away from our work is that getting published in English has much more to do with resources, with access to brokers, to being parts of academic research networks. And a lot of journal editors will say that English is not actually what's getting in the way. And even in these 95 text histories that we have, I don't think we had any one where the paper was rejected because of the English. But what's interesting is that there is a sense that if you're reading a manuscript that's clearly written by someone whose first language is not English, that you're kind of it already puts you in a little bit of a doubtful mood. I think that's highly problematic. I mean, I think one thing editors could be doing even more than reviewers is giving clear instructions to reviewers. And usually when you're reviewing for a journal, they will have a set of guidelines, whether people consult them or not, to say, don't worry right now about any language issues. I mean, I have to say, having reviewed papers for journals for 25 years or more, native English speaker, just because you're a native English speaker doesn't mean you're a good writer. I mean, that's for sure. And so, I mean, I often will make more comments about language and writing on a paper that I believe has been written by a native English speaker. I don't know for sure, because usually those are kinds of issues that are interfering with the meaning. Clearly, there are manuscripts that people submit that are very hard to understand because of the English. But I think for most, and in my experience reviewing, and I was for 5 years a co-editor of one section of a journal, those tend to be, in my experience, coming from students where, I'm guessing a paper, and I've said this to my own students, oh, this is a really good paper. You could get a version of it published in a journal, and students just hear you could get this published in a journal and they send it right in. So that is the novice end that is partially related to language, but it's more related to not understanding the social practices of writing for publication.
Yeah, and I would definitely agree. One of the things I picked up in your paper is this conflation. There's many things that are being conflated when reviewers review the paper, but one of the things that is being conflated is I'm thinking that like being proficient language user is being proficient writer. And sometimes I also get the impression that when reviewers comment on the language, they sense that there's something going on with the language. So they will say, well, check your grammar and spelling, not knowing really what they're picking on, because there isn't enough background that they have necessarily in working with writing, right? So I feel like in some ways I want to say, oh, reviewers need just a little bit more knowledge in terms of like how to respond to writing. But I also know that this is kind of unfeasible because, this is unpaid work and people just, like they just are asked to review without any sort of preparation. And again, and this is understandable in the system that we work in, but clearly there is a need for more education, maybe a little bit. So I have many more questions, but I already see that Staszek, one of our group members, also has questions. So maybe we'll transition to that and see what the audience wants to ask too.
Sure, thank you.
Yeah, I think I can agree with Ola that we can make a smooth transition towards, the wider discussion with other participants. So Staszek, if you can join us and add your question, comment.
Okay, thank you very much for the presentation. It's been wonderful to hear. And the question I have is related to the status of linguistic norms, the norms of linguistic correctness. It seems to me that in the reviews you have been, there is not just the issue of the English being treated as one monolithic standard language, but also linguistic norms, correctness norms, are being treated like objective norms. You can make a mistake. It's obvious that that's a mistake. And I find it pretty strange that it's linguistic norms that we tend to treat this way, to forget the work that went into this illusion of objectivity, the work like Longman dictionaries, all the institutions in various countries, academies, and so on, that have made us believe that linguistic norms are objective and that we can make mistakes by not adhering to them. And so my question would be whether we see some way to maybe trace this vision of language in reviews to this kind of social work that has been done either within science or within broader society to make us believe that these are objective rules.
Absolutely. I mean, I think this is clearly been demonstrated, and there's a broader discussion of so-called standard or dominant norms of English. And in the US, this has also been recently related to the racial justice movement. And we see that, varieties of English, like African-American English, for decades or centuries were called bad English. You had to learn how to use good English. I think it's densely interwoven throughout society. And we know, I can remember, although my parents were, my father was a Latin professor, so keenly aware of language, but also I think there's a sense of when you're growing up, your parents tell you what's okay to say and what's not okay. And I'm not talking about cursing, I'm talking about forms of language, right? You get corrected as a small child, particularly all of, as you mentioned about dictionaries, the creation of dictionaries, the codification of language, all of that work for the past couple of centuries or older has I think really been driven from a sense that this is a way of setting standards, and maybe not an explicit sense, but that these standards are not going to be accessible by everyone. They're going to be used as a gatekeeping and filtering mechanism. And so, I mean, I think there is a tension here, because as somebody who is, I also consider myself a writer, including a creative writer, there is an aesthetic pleasure to well-written work, well, even academic work. But I think there's a difference between making something a little bit more enjoyable to read versus rejecting something because it's not meeting an artificial standard. And I think that that's really the gatekeeping place. Our work would suggest that the scholars in our study, very few of them were having their work rejected because of English. It was rejected. Now, there's other ways that their locality is marked. For example, we have some examples in our 2010 book, naming the location of the research. We had one example where a researcher said, could you explain why this research was done in Madrid? You know, like, who's ever heard of Madrid? So, you know, like, I think, well, I could write a study that was conducted in Rochester and nobody would care. Rochester is a city of 200,000 people. But if you have to explain why you're doing a study in Madrid, that shows you the kind of parochial lens of the reviewer. So there, we saw those kinds of issues coming up. We saw issues of methodology, where certain methodologies were not considered to be in vogue or to be considered cutting edge, or just not considered to be scientific enough, like qualitative research methodologies. And we also saw theoretical trends, that people who were using certain theorists in their work were not considered to be, you know, of the moment. They were not considered to be publishable. We saw also a lot of issues related to resources. The people can't read the research literature, therefore their lit reviews are not up to date, and therefore the whole framing of their paper was considered to be irrelevant. So I think what I, just to come back to your question, English in this case is often used as an indexical, as a proxy for all of these other issues, which is basically to say, we think that academic work, research work, scientific work should look like exactly what we do. And if you don't have that kind of situation that enables you to do your work, we are not interested. And so that is a problem of a kind of parochial attitude of the Anglophone world that's controlling most of the journals that a lot of regimes are saying are the ones that everybody should be publishing in.
Okay, so in that case, I would like to open the floor for other participants. Any questions? Now it's a good time to pose them. Okay, I can see a question from Lynn. Lynn, nice to see you. Hello.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you so much for that really stimulating talk. It's lovely to meet you. I've read lots of your work, and it's nice to meet you. My own personal background is in translation. I'm a translator trainer, and I particularly conduct research on translation technologies. And I'm just curious to hear from you in the conversations and analyses that you've done over the past couple of decades throughout your longitudinal work. How has translation come into the conversation, or has it? And how has that conversation changed, maybe particularly recently, as we've seen pretty significant advancements in translation technologies just in the past 4 or 5 years? And I'm wondering if that might be seen now as a potential for contributing to this world of multilingual academic communication. I'm just really curious to hear what you've heard about translation.
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, in the early parts of our work, I was fascinated to see that places in Central Europe in particular actually had translators on staff. I mean, that was considered a key mode for enabling scholars to make their work available in English. In other contexts, scholars would use grant money to pay for translation. And then we became connected with a group called Mediterranean Editors and Translators, which is a wonderful group in Europe working in this field, particularly in kind of scientific translation. They are the ones that created this term authors editors. So really working with authors to help prepare their manuscripts. I'm sure you're aware, Lynn, and other people maybe as well, that, you know, there's a lot of tension in translation, because translation folks know you can't just translate anything, right? You have to be specialized in scientific translation and even in particular fields in order to do a good job. And one thing that we saw was a number of our participants who had actually paid for translation were often very unhappy with the resulting work. And so they either abandoned that approach or they would have to rewrite the translator's work. And so it really became an issue. And that is partially because of the cost of professional translation. A professional translator versus somebody's cousin who's an English teacher, it's night and day. But even within professional translation, you need to have someone who's specialized in the particular area. We know that a lot of academic language is highly nuanced within particular fields. I mean, the word discourse means different things in different fields, for example. So, and I'm talking about within English. So, you know, a translator has to be somebody who's highly knowledgeable about the academic field, in addition to the languages that they're working with. And so that's probably too rare in terms of the need and the demand. We haven't interviewed participants recently enough about translation, but I do remember toward the end of the phase where we were doing a lot of interviews, a colleague, this is probably 7 or 8 years ago, saying that she uses, or a participant saying that she uses Google Translate. She'll write in Portuguese, use Google Translate to translate into English, and then edit the English herself. Now we know there are improvements in Google Translate. There's DeepL. There are, and I mean, Lynn, we're citing you in papers that are about to come out where we're talking about multilingualism, and we're actually advocating that people should be considering this, both from the author's perspective, but also from journals' perspective. We now have, most of our journals are available online. Some of them are only available online, where there's this kind of idea of unlimited capacity to host translations of papers online, and certainly for scholars to translate into and out of our preferred language. So I think that, I mean, I remember being very skeptical of machine translation 20 years ago, just thinking like, this is never going to happen, but it is happening. And I'm involved in a project with my church to help some kids in Honduras in one village have access to school, and they write us letters. Some of them are in Spanish. Because I speak Spanish, I used to translate those letters myself. And the most recent batch, I thought, I bet Google Translate can do this a lot faster than I can. Not only faster, but better. I mean, I could just in that one experience see the improvements in Google Translate. So I think this is definitely a step or a resource that will help move towards, you know, at least greater access. I think it would be fascinating to find out what happens to papers that have gone through that process when they get to this gatekeeping stage, when they get to this evaluation stage. But I think this is something where, again, these disciplinary fields of translation, of artificial intelligence, and language studies of various types really need to be talking more than they are. So
Great.
For those of you who don't know, Lynn is probably the leading scholar on this topic right now. So I'm thrilled that you're here, Lynn.
Thank you. I'm really happy to hear that you see the use of machine translation as a writing aid, which is something that I've really kind of come around to as well, because I started as a translator, but now I'm really seeing the value of this tool, not for translation per se, but as a writing aid. And I think that's one important change in my thinking that has happened. And I really see that in some ways, well, in this context anyway, machine translation is more suited for that than for translation per se. The other thing is that, unfortunately, the underlying architecture of machine translation right now is still favoring what I would describe as widely used languages. So although I'm not surprised to hear that your experience with English to Spanish or Spanish to English translation worked very well, these tools are data driven at the moment. And so if people are working with a language that's less widely used, the quality is not at the same level as for the more widely used languages. So we're still in that position of kind of, I guess, peripheral or marginalization of those languages that are not as widely used, but I think we're making progress. So thank you so much for sharing that. It was really interesting. Thank you.
All right, great to see those kinds of interactions. So any other questions?
I maybe will have a follow-up question, unless somebody else has more questions. No, okay. So one of the questions also I was thinking about asking is related to some of the initiatives that we have like online, and I actually mentioned in an email to you the consortium on democratizing academic knowledge construction. And what do you think about these initiatives where we kind of, and for those who haven't heard about it, this particular initiative is led by Dr. Kanagaraja, and he is inviting other scholars, and I would say center scholars in the sense of scholars from the United States, and like whose maybe first language is English. I don't know if that's a criterion, but to serve as writing mentors to scholars from peripheral countries, probably the countries where there's no access necessarily to support for writing and for academic publishing, so they can kind of break through with their research into more the international or top tier journals. I don't know if that's also a criterion, but do you think that having such initiatives, and you mentioned you also had some kind of initiative, do you think that it's kind of helping to perpetuate the problem? Or do you think that in the sense that we're not fighting with the system, but we're trying to like work the system? So do you think that we should be maybe doing more to impact academic publishing in general, or are these initiatives something that you would recommend, or you what is your thought on that?
I mean, when Kanagaraja was editor of TESOL Quarterly about 15 years ago, he tried something similar. He invited me to participate in this new initiative, and because I'm on sabbatical this semester and I have 8 PhD students, I said, no, not now. I said, check with me next fall. But I think that this is part of the problem, which you were referring to, Ola, before, which is reviewers are already volunteering. And you know, institutional structures are different around the world. I mean, I have what I think is a fairly high PhD student load, but compared to many institutional structures in this country, I have a lower teaching load. So, you know, it's one way or another, whatever your workload is, we are all overworked. I mean, academia has just become this kind of neoliberal work factory. So I think to ask scholars to volunteer more time when we're already being constantly asked to review articles, to take on students, to do all kinds of institutional service, I think that's an inherent problem. And you may get people who will say, yes, I'll do one. And his pitch when he invited me was, you know, it'll be a couple manuscripts a year. Well, I can tell you a couple manuscripts a year, if you're working with someone over time in multiple drafts, that could be 20, 30 hours of time. You know, it really depends. But I love your question about, is this perpetuating the problem? Because, and I haven't had a chance to speak with him directly. I'm hoping maybe to see him at conferences this spring. To what extent is a program like that that's focusing on the language and the manuscript ignoring these larger issues of access to resources, academic research networks. And I don't know how he's screening people to be in that program, you know, who is going to have access to it. Is it be people who are submitting to a particular journal or people who sign up through an association? I didn't, because I said no right for the moment, I didn't go through all of that with him. But I think, you know, I feel like one of the strongest messages I would like the world to receive from all this research that I've been involved in is it's not just about the language, and it's about being part of academic research communities, being able to go to conferences, whether those are virtual or in person, learning who are the top scholars in your field, what are they doing, what journals are they working with, what research methodologies are they using, what research questions are currently of interest. And when I was co-editing one section of TESOL Quarterly, a lot of the manuscripts that I would not send out for review it wasn't because they were written by non-native English speakers. It was because they were treating topics that the field hasn't been working on since the 80s. You know, their references were for 1976. And this is not their fault. They don't have access to resources. So I think some of the bigger fights that we should be fighting have to do with open access journals and how can publishers be pushed to, or forced in some cases, to make their content available more globally, more freely. Our librarian, one of our librarians here is working on, or I guess our librarians in general are working on pushing scholars to agree, or not scholars, publishers, when these libraries, which are spending millions of dollars a year to subscribe to a whole set of journals from somebody like Springer, that they are basically, the libraries are now working to say, if we're going to buy all these journals from you, we want open access. You know, we want to have some kind of reciprocity here. And I'm sure you're all familiar with the critique that many of us are working for not that much money to do this research, or governments are funding the research, and then we're giving it for free to the publishers, and then they're charging us to have access to the work that we created. So that's an inherent problem, right?
Yeah, so I wonder, because I you know, like I'm a lot of the time I'm focused on the issues of writing in English as a second language and academic publishing and all these inequalities. But then you look at how the system is set up, and like the fact that academic publishing is the most profitable business, like almost in the world, that it's more profitable than Google and some other businesses. And so there is not really, there's this like big systemic problem that we're trying to help scholars, but really the whole setup is just evil and wrong, right? So like the system is, this is a big, larger systemic problem, and we're trying to like do small changes in it, but really until some of these other initiatives don't take off and open access, etc., then maybe some of these issues, even with standard English and gatekeeping and maintaining the powers and kind of fueling these profits, are going to stay in place. So I'm just a little bit kind of discouraged, because one of the things also I mentioned to you as an early academic scholar, I really didn't understand before I started publishing that, for example, I'm not going to get language support from the editor, maybe, or a journal in general, that you know, they make so much money on some of the publications that, you know, I send them, and they give nothing in return apart from the free labor of the editor and the reviewers. And that was surprising to me, because why wouldn't there be more support if they are kind of taking my work, right? So
there used to be. I mean, actually, my first career before I got into academia, I worked in the publishing field. But there used to be more institutional support, editorial support in terms of language for academic journals, and the publishing industry in general. If you notice, many books now have many more typos and need more editing than they used to, because the publishing industry in general and the academic publishing industry have just realized that they can cut that cost of human labor, and that's one place they can cut costs. But I think that that's a big, and you may have seen on some journals' websites, they're saying we offer an editing service that you can now pay for.
Yeah.
So I think that's another area, but that is kind of like the tail end of it, because that's when you, well, there's two moments. One is editing service before you submit your paper, and the other is editing for manuscripts that are about to be published. And Teresa and I are currently guest editing a special issue of the Journal of English for Research Publishing Purposes, JERP. And it's published by John Benjamins. And they have told us they're basically doing no editing. They will proofread it, which is just really checking for typos. Of course, we can use spell check. And they'll check the references if the references are matching up. So, I mean, I'm going to be doing that work myself in the next few weeks, because we want to offer to our authors who are in the special issue, but also to the readers, something that has been edited. And we're not going to be editing to make it look like native speaker English, but just to look at it word by word, phrase by phrase, to say, is this language clear? Is it conveying what we think the author wants to convey? And then we'll check it with them, and then we'll be doing it. But most journals now, I mean, when I teach about this in my publishing courses or workshops, I just use that old computer acronym, garbage in, garbage out, right? And I mean, it's kind of not very pleasant, but basically I say to my students, I mean, I'm yelling at my students all the time, you didn't even use spell check on this thing you sent me. Like, that is a minimum standard. Now, spell check, we know, doesn't catch everything, but that's not even editing, that's just proofreading. I think I do think there's a movement, and the one you mentioned, and there's some other open science initiatives and some multilingual publishing initiatives that are coming up. But I think that they're growing. There's a little bit of a groundswell, but I think the other place that we haven't really talked about is, as long as publishing, as institutional evaluation regimes, whether yours comes from your institution or your government or your department, as long as they are pushing, and we know that in some places, departments will have a list of acceptable journals where scholars can send their work. And if they don't send them there, it's not counted for much or anything. As long as that kind of thing is still going on, which it will be going on unless we change it, when those kinds of conditions are imposed externally, that also plays into this whole thing. So if you have to submit to Q1 SCI or SSCI journals, then your department or your institution or your government has already constrained where you're able to publish your work, and they're pushing into this system of standard English and all of all of these things. So I think one of the things we've argued in this recent series of papers that we've written is that the kind of, and interestingly, last year or a couple of years ago, China has started to move back away from its heavy push on English medium, SCI, now called Clarivate Analytics, that, these journals that China was really investing huge amounts of money in the past 15, 20 years, they're starting to realize that has skewed the whole process of knowledge production and distribution in their country. So I think there may be a little bit of a pendulum swing. I don't think it's extremely strong yet, but I think that if we think about all of these things converging, there may be a point at which the system opens back up a little bit.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that answer.
Okay, so we have maybe time for one more question, if there is one. Okay, Staszek, and please forgive me if I pronounce it wrongly, and Hayat. So Staszek, if you could pose your question, and then we will ask Hayat to join, okay?
Yes, hi, thank you so much for this presentation. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Yes, because my internet connection is a little bit spotty. I just have a question for Mary Jane Curie. In terms of the three orientations that she described, the last one that was the concerned interventionist, don't you, for me, when you were describing it, it sounded really more of the concerned collaborator, because I mean, although they did intervene maybe in the paper, working on some sections, making some changes, but they are more collaborators, if we compare them to the others, because interventionists for me sounded like, they are taking maybe the liberty to, work on the paper. Maybe I'm not saying, reappropriating it or, anything like that. But, I would see them really as collaborators more than interventionists. So I don't know what, I would like to know more, about this specific orientation, if possible.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think you're raising a good point, and I think some of this has to do with connotations of particular words. We use the term in our 2006 article where we introduced this concept of literacy brokers. We talked about interventions by literacy brokers, and I think there can be a slight negative connotation to interventions, but I think what's useful about that term is that it does signal the power dimensions that are still involved. So that the quotations, the examples that I provided for the concerned interventionist stance, I mean, those are from journal editors. And I would be hesitant to call them collaborators because there's still this power dimension. And it can be difficult, and we've seen this in our qualitative data. When an editor tells an author, here's how I think this might be better in your paper, there's not an equal power dynamic there, right? It's not just like your co-author says, oh, I think we should do it this way, and you say, I think I should do it the other way. So I think an editor is still in this power position where a suggestion is maybe an intervention. But I think the orientation to collaboration is there. It's maybe the underlying motivation is, let me help you get this paper to a point where it says what you want it to say and we can publish it in the journal. Whereas the other ones were basically saying, yeah, this is an issue, not my problem. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Okay.
So Staszek, would you like to pose yours?
Yes, I've just been wondering whether there is a little more you might tell us about the reactions authors have to the way the English language is being reviewed.
Mm-hmm. Well, I would say that it's because English is never just about English, that it's sometimes I think authors responded. Sometimes authors are just, and this would happen to me if I tried to publish in Spanish or French, in fact, this one piece we wrote that we're just about to submit for a handbook on multilingualism. We actually included text from us, the 5 co-authors. It includes 3 of my PhD students in Chinese and Swahili and Arabic and Spanish. And so the small amounts of Spanish that I had, I asked a friend who's a native Spanish speaker, who's also an academic, to check them for me, and he found a few minor things. So I was very grateful. This was a very minor example. And I think there is, on one level, when writers receive useful feedback about their English, they're happy to have the help. But that's to me, that's sort of a surface level kind of situation. I think when scholars receive the kinds of reviews that we included in those text histories, those quotations that basically start to slide into the deficit mode, and in fact, sometimes use the word deficient. To have your language called deficient, even if you're using an additional language, it's pretty harsh. So scholars were angry, they were frustrated, they were resentful. Because we have such a huge data set, you have the whole continuum of emotions. There were some cases where editors worked very closely over many drafts with scholars to make sure their papers got published, and they were very happy to have that support. There were cases that was just more routine, kind of like any of us might experience in any language, which is, there's always something we can improve in our text, no matter how experienced we are. And so if you're getting what feels like useful, supportive feedback, you think, okay, great, I can use this, or I can make decisions about it. There were some cases where scholars didn't feel that they really could make their own decisions, that the ownership of the text had transferred to the editor. If they wanted it to be published in a particular journal, they really had no choice about. And I would say this is not limited to multilingual scholars, but I think with multilingual scholars, there is this added dimension of language and kind of being from a different place, the locality issue that we've talked about. I mean, in my study in Chile, scholars were very savvy. I had some participants who talked about really not feeling that they needed to use the for pay editing service that was made available by Springer or whoever, whatever journal publisher, but going through it anyhow, paying for it anyhow, so that it would show up on their record as having done it. So I thought that was extremely tactical, that they were basically saying like, I'm just playing this, I'm clearly playing this game to play it, not because I believe I need it. So, you know, I mean, the methodological challenge with doing this kind of work is you can never get everyone's perspectives. So we can never get the perspectives of the reviewers or the editors on a particular, I mean, that would be, from my perspective, a fantastic data set to have not only the authors participants, but these other people involved in the process. But I think there's some studies, as I mentioned before, about journal editors or formal editors in our field who have had access to big sets of reviews. But even there, I don't think they've interviewed the reviewers or the editors, or they are the editors, but they haven't interviewed the reviewers themselves, which I think would be quite interesting.
Okay, thank you very much. I think that we almost run out of time, so I would say that, and I also don't see any further questions. So I think that our seminar ran its course, and we can just some final remarks are to be made. First of all, thank you very much once again, and it was great to see you, and once again, big thanks for accepting our invitation.
Yeah.
We are not saying goodbye, because we hope that you all will join us in upcoming weeks. We have much more plans and much more events coming in few weeks. So just in January, there will be 2 more seminars. One of them will also be on the problem of multilingualism in scholarly communication. So if you are interested, maybe consider subscribing to our newsletter to keep in touch. And we really hope that we see you all again, and you will join us for next events. So thank you again to our main guest, but also to all the participants for today's meeting. Thank you.
Thank you very much for inviting me. I've really enjoyed this, and I hope it connected enough with the focus of your work that it was useful.
Okay, everyone. Thank you very much. I think we can now disconnect. Bye-bye.
Bye.